Hi, my name is Alexandra Schindel, and I'm an associate professor of science education at the University at Buffalo. I'm going to be talking today about critical pedagogies of place. Much of my own research currently focuses on science learning and participation in relation to place. That is, I am concerned with both understanding how young people engage in science and sense making of science, as well as sense making of place and the interrelationships between science and place. And as they do so, I want to understand how youth view and see science and themselves as science actors and meaning makers, and how youth see place and themselves as place actors and meaning makers. I plan to dive deeply into a few critical theories that focus on place in science, and I want to share with you how I have engaged in research that applies these theories and complicates them through what gets revealed in the research process. Before I do this, I want to share with you why place pedagogies matter. Global environmental concerns are one of the most pressing issues of our time because of their enormity and their basis in human activity. They force us to examine and to question our relationships with land. So at the start of this presentation, I want to engage in my own reflections on place and invite you to do so as well. I'm going to give you some time to describe a place that matters to you. First, I'll state that my home and the University at Buffalo sit on the traditional lands of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. My life and work are made possible only because of the historical colonization, dispossession, and forced removal of Indigenous communities. In the next few videos, I'm going to introduce you a little more to Buffalo, New York, and situate the land, the place, the people, and the history and current context of this location. So gonna take you on a little bit of a field trip. I want to introduce you to a few historically significant places where I live in Western New York, and to share with you the importance of the history of colonization, migration, and industrialization within this particular region. The first is the Kinzua Dam and I-86 on the Allegheny Reservation, which can be seen here at the bottom of this map, and a closer version is here on this map. The building of the Kinzua Dam on Allegheny River near Salamanca in 1965 was a momentous event. The construction of the dam displaced more than 600 Seneca Nation members and submerged 10,000 acres, nearly a third of the Seneca territory. Homes and forests were burned and then flooded. 2,000 graves, including the 1836 grave of Chief Corn Planter, were moved, but many other graves were lost. This land grab broke the 1794 Canandaigua Treaty and resulted in the loss of considerable fertile soils. The majority of Seneca had practiced traditional ways until being displaced by the dam project and deeply resented the forcible change of their way of life. In 1964, the Seneca lost an appeal over the relocation of a 4-lane highway through the remaining portion of the Allegheny Reservation, and this caused the loss of more land to the interstate, which divided the reservation territory. The construction of the road and dam divided tribal members who had long lived side by side and separated two communities that now must travel significant distances to see their friends and family. You can better see Interstate 86 and how it intersects the Allegheny Reservation on this map. Another loss can be seen in the building of the Niagara Power Project. In 1960, the construction of the Niagara Falls Power Project in what is now Lewiston marked another significant blow to the region's native population. Led by Robert Moses, New York State seized 550 acres of the Tuscarora Reservation through eminent domain to form a reservoir. Moses's initial offer to the Tuscarora tribe was just $1,000 per acre, while at the same time he was offering an adjacent university $50,000 per acre. The case eventually went to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the state. As a result of this project, 37 homes were destroyed and 175 members of the Tuscarora tribe were displaced. Fishing on the reserve, which had played a significant role in providing food to Native families, became almost non-existent. Not surprisingly, on the Niagara Power Authority website, it claims, quote, "Land for the reservoir was legally taken by the government from the Tuscarora Indians. The New York State Power Authority wanted to seize 1,350 acres of the 6,300-acre Indian reservation. The Tuscarora Indians fought this expropriation to the United States Supreme Court." Western New York also serves as a location of one of the worst Indian residential schools in the United States, the Thomas Indian School. Indian schools are arguably one of the most destructive examples of forced assimilation. The goal of this effort was to destroy Native communities and culture. Native children, many of whom were forcibly taken from their families, were forced to abandon their Native identities, cultures, and language. Children were punished for using Native language and suffered abuse, loss, and sometimes death. The Thomas Indian School was founded in 1855 on the Cattaraugus Seneca Reservation and operated for almost 100 years. Because it was founded as an orphanage, unlike federally funded boarding schools like the Carlisle, which is most famous, it is often lost in conversations about boarding schools. It began as a somewhat benevolent institution, taking in Native children from across New York State and helping children to learn Iroquois languages. Unfortunately, the structure of the school changed in 1875 when the State Board of Charities took it over. Thousands of Native children were sent there and very few reunited with their parents or siblings. Many of today's elders in Western New York attended the Thomas Indian School. Another significant location in our collective and ecological history of Western New York is the Love Canal. Love Canal is a neighborhood in Niagara Falls just north of where I live and is infamous as the location of a 70-acre landfill that became the site of an enormous environmental disaster in the 1970s. In the 1920s, the canal became a dump site for municipal refuse for the city of Niagara Falls. During the 1940s, the canal was purchased by Hooker Chemical Company, which used the site to dump roughly 20,000 tons of chemical byproducts from the manufacturing of dyes, perfumes, and solvents for rubber and synthetic resins. Love Canal was shockingly sold to the local school district in 1953 for $1 when the company realized the dump was becoming a liability due to the housing nearby. In the 1970s, families in the area complained of toxic smells and waste leaking into their basements. Decades of dumping toxic chemicals harmed the health of hundreds of residents. They became increasingly sick with extremely high rates of cancer, birth defects, and one study found 33% of the residents had undergone chromosomal damage. Data showed unacceptable levels of toxic vapors associated with more than 80 compounds were emanating from the basements of numerous homes in the first ring directly adjacent to the Love Canal. The community fought for the government to buy them out of their homes and even kidnapped federal government officials to gain national attention and force the government's hand. This fight led the federal government to pass the Superfund law, a program that identifies sites contaminated by hazardous waste and charges those responsible for the waste to clean it or pay for it. The resulting Superfund cleanup operation demolished a portion of the Love Canal neighborhood. Notably, these points in history are not always included in teachers' curricula, in part because they do not know the history themselves and have not sought out this information, in part because the school district provides standards that are meant to cover topics and not designed to help learners invest in the places we inhabit, and in part because, like most teacher populations, our teachers primarily identify as white and the white community often struggles to teach histories such as these that may be seen as controversial topics, but I would argue are only really controversial because they demonstrate aspects of colonialism and how the historical construction of whiteness as privilege and land as property ownership in the United States is disproportionately destructive to low income and non white communities and favors corporate and governmental interests. However, learning these histories teaches us about the communities, the people, the land, the relationships between lands and peoples, and helps us to understand the current relationships between lands and peoples that we see around us.
I am coming to you right now from a location on the Niagara River. It's called Buffalo's Broderick Park, and behind me you can see across the river is Canada. So this is one of the closest locations that you can get between the US and Canada in our area. And it's significant for a number of reasons. But I come here for a couple of reasons, and one is I think that both the history and the current context of this location gives you some idea of the many layers of humans and more than humans who have inhabited this place or who are inhabiting it, and the ways in which they inhabit it. And that Buffalo has a rich history and current context that can kind of be seen within this place in particular. So historically in the 1800s, as escaped slaves were escaping into freedom, they would travel on what was called the Underground Railroad. And this here is a documented site of the Underground Railroad. Folks would wait until the river froze over in the wintertime, and then they would cross on foot into Canada to get to freedom. Currently, this site is interesting because Buffalo is one of the most highly segregated cities in the United States. I think it's the top 6th segregated city. And it's segregated by race, ethnicity, and socioeconomics. So we rarely interact with one another, I would say. But this site is a place where folks do interact for recreational purposes. You can see behind me some people along the water, and they are fishing. And if you look along that area, there are some more fisher folks. And what's interesting is people from all over the area and all over the city come here to fish. So we have communities speaking multiple different languages from many different races and ethnicities who come and fish in this location and interact in this location. One of the places that matters to me is my home and my backyard in particular. I've lived here for 3 years, and when I moved in, this entire space that you see here was covered in broken concrete. And so I've been working to learn to cultivate the land and to take care of it in a different way. Right now I've got a bit of a monoculture going with this grass, which is not necessarily the healthiest. And I'm learning to seek out native plants to invite our native species here. But a big piece of this is learning from the land that's here and the plants that are here, and cultivating a relationship here. Much of the dirt I've discovered has a whole lot of rocks in it, so I can't dig very deeply. So I've got some stuff going on here. These are things that are either planted or waiting to be planted. My little hostas. And the dirt is, the soil needs to be nurtured. And that's my current project, nurturing the soil, and learning from the plants and the land what works best here.
Now that that I've introduced you a little bit to Buffalo and to the places that I inhabit and places that matter to me, I want to invite each of you to begin keeping a record of your own wonderings and reflections during this session. So take some time now to pause the video and write or draw and diagram a place that matters to you. A place that matters to you comes from an Indigenous stance. It means, what lands or locations do you have a connection to? How can knowing this influence your work or help you be grounded in your work as a human, a science educator and knower, and as a researcher? Sharing these gives us insight into each other's lives and helps us understand each other, who each other is, and what relations matter for each other. I have a few goals for this session. The first is to engage in the thoughtful endeavor of considering place within science education, or more accurately, complicating place with critical theories based upon principles of equity and justice and indigeneity for land, people, and more than human inhabitants. And second is to examine practices of curriculum theorizing, or what I call adding empirical meat to the theoretical bones through generative research. You may be wondering at this point, what do relationships with places and land have to do with science or with engaging as a knower and doer of science? We're going to read and reflect on a few readings as we dive into this topic. Feel free to write your reactions and ideas about these readings and this presentation in your own notes. First, I'm going to situate this work in critical theory. Drawing upon Kincheloe and Maclaren's work, I define a criticalist as a researcher or theorist who attempts to use her or his work as a form of social or cultural criticism and to accept certain basic assumptions. That certain groups in society and particular societies are privileged over others. And although the reasons for this privileging may vary widely, the oppression that characterizes contemporary societies gets most forcefully reproduced when subordinates accept their social status as natural, necessary, or inevitable. That oppression has many faces, and that focusing on only one at the expense of others, example class oppression versus racism, often elides the interconnections among them. That all thought is fundamentally mediated by power relations that are socially and historically constituted. And finally, that mainstream research practices are generally, although most often unwittingly, implicated in the reproduction of systems of class, race, and gender oppression. While critical theory has been widely accepted within education research and within science education, critical theories have often neglected Indigenous knowledges and only more recently incorporated critical race theory into practice. Indigenous wisdom and land education force us to consider our relationships with land and with it, how the people, lands, and more than human inhabitants of Earth are constructed, positioned, neglected, and situated within overlapping systems of power and oppression. As Kristen Knopf articulates in the Turn Toward Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Practices in the Academy, since the 1990s, Indigenous scholars have called for an indigenizing of the Academy, integrating Indigenous knowledges into discourses and practices of institutions of higher education worldwide. The calls to integrate Indigenous and Western knowledge discourses and practices mainly come from Indigenous researchers throughout the world. They indict the quote-unquote self-evident primacy of Western knowledges and presumptuous disregard for Indigenous knowledges in universities that reproduce colonial dominance and epistemic violence. Within science education, several researchers examine how multiple epistemologies can be incorporated and enacted alongside Western science. The significance here is that science should not be learned or taught as if it exists in a vacuum, devoid of our cultures, depoliticized and ahistorical. Instead, it must be seen and learned within our cultural and political contexts. Ultimately, as science educators, we are called upon to develop pedagogies that support students to engage with and learn Western science alongside other epistemologies they bring into their worlds. Megan Bang in Science Education has forwarded these ideas. I've listed some of her work in the reading section. As she and Douglas Medine describe, while there has been a lot of attention on increasing the participation and achievement of diverse communities within science education, much of this work has made diversifying the goal. End quote, tended to assume that science and science learning are acultural, end quote. In their work, they have focused, on culturally based epistemological orientations and their relation to the cultural practices associated with science education, thus supporting a shift in orientation towards science education from aiming to have students adopt specific epistemologies, i.e. Western science, and towards supporting students' navigation of multiple epistemologies. But what might this look like? That is, what does it look like in practice when we incorporate and situate ourselves and our work within multiple epistemologies? One of my favorite teachers and representations of this work comes from Robin Wall Kimmerer, whose book, Braiding Sweetgrass, beautifully navigates across time, place, epistemology, and her own roles as a mother, a botanist, and to share how these identities and epistemologies can help heal our relationships with land. First, she situates this work in settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a form of colonialism that seeks to replace the original population of the colonized territory with a new society of settlers. As with all forms of colonialism, it is based on exogenous domination, typically organized or supported by an imperial authority. Robin Wall Kimmerer teaches us about Indigenous perspectives towards land, or what the Indigenous knowledge teaches us about relationships with land. Speaking of this history of settler colonialism in the US, and specifically of the forced removal of Native peoples from their homelands, she shares, children, language, lands, almost everything was stripped away, stolen when you weren't looking because you were trying to stay alive. In the face of such loss, one thing our people could not surrender was the meaning of land. In the settler mind, land was property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. But to our people, it was everything: identity, the connection to our ancestors, the home of our non-human kinfolk, our pharmacy, our library, the source of all that sustained us. Our lands were where our responsibility to the world was enacted, sacred ground. It belonged to itself. It was a gift, not a commodity, so it could never be bought or sold. I invite you to consider Indigenous perspectives toward land alongside your own perspectives and relationships with land and the places you inhabit. This is a process of decolonizing our ideas of relationships with land and understandings of science. I define here decolonization as the process of deconstructing colonial ideologies of the superiority and privilege of Western thought and approaches. On the one hand, decolonization involves dismantling structures that perpetuate the status quo and addressing unbalanced power dynamics. On the other hand, decolonization involves valuing and revitalizing Indigenous knowledge and approaches and weeding out settler biases or assumptions that have impacted Indigenous ways of being. For non-Indigenous people, decolonization is the process of examining your beliefs about Indigenous peoples and culture by learning about yourself in relationship to the communities where you live and the people with whom you interact. And so, I again invite you to engage in decolonization and to learn about the integration of Indigenous wisdom and Western science. We can rarely visualize what this integration looks like in practice, particularly if we're raised within Western knowledge systems. But Kimmerer Kimmerer's book does just this. It serves as a representation of the ways in which Indigenous wisdom and Western science come together for her as a botanist, mother, and writer. As you read, I ask that you reflect on the following and write down your ideas. In Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer uses the tools of science and nature and embraces the notion that plants and animals are our teachers. She articulates how awakening our consciousness of ecology and our engagement with the world around us requires us to embrace our reciprocal relationship with the living world. This chapter that you'll be reading is representative of many of her chapters, which stand in many ways as standalone essays. In this one, she is taking a group of students from her college ecology class into nature for a 5-week stint. So you'll get to see how she engages with her students, as well as how she engages them in learning from the natural world. As you read, I ask that you reflect on the following and write down your ideas. First, what are the big ideas that you take away from this reading? And second, how are Western science, or botany, and Indigenous wisdom represented in the reading? In processing Braiding Sweetgrass, I want to share with you some of my reflections. In February of 2020, Kimmerer's book made it to the New York Times bestseller list after being published 7 years earlier. When asked why it may resonate with people, she shared, quote, "When we're looking at things we cherish falling apart, when inequities and injustices are so apparent, people are looking for another way that we can be living. We need interdependence rather than independence, and Indigenous knowledge has a message of valuing connection, especially to the humble," end quote. I wonder what she would say now, having been through a year of a pandemic, since this was recorded a month before the world shut down. In the chapter that you read, Kimmerer shares her relationship with the earth with her students. She teaches them to see the land around them differently. I heard her speak in a video recently in which she shared that her goal as a teacher is to help students fall in love with the planet. I'm embracing this goal myself, learning from Kimmerer as my teacher. While I may have thought about or oriented some of my ways of being in the world similar to what Kimmerer espouses, I have never considered how the earth and I, or the earth and all of us, exist in a reciprocal relationship. I am disheartened by the ways we humans have exploited and continue to exploit Earth's natural resources. I'm a mother, and I worry about the future that our children will inherit. But through reading and reflecting on the work of Kimmerer, I've come to view my engagement through different lenses, those of reciprocal living with the world. My 13-year-old daughter has climate anxiety and can struggle with sleep at night for fear of what the world will look like and whether she will get to live the rich adult life she dreams of. Given her stresses, and after learning from Kimmerer, I've embraced teaching my children to embrace the land and cultivate the soil for a garden with me. When they don't want to get their hands dirty, I ask them to sit by me and talk while I dig in the dirt. They almost always end up digging in the soil alongside me and sharing their wonder at what they learn. I used to see cultivating a garden as an arduous task, but now I'm curious how it will influence my relationship with my children, our relationships with food, and our relationship with the land we are currently living on. This work has also made me curious about an oft-used word in science education, science literacy. We often hear that science literacy is the goal of science education and that students should become, quote, scientifically literate citizens, end quote. However, there is little agreement on what this means and scant research attempting to assess it. When I read this chapter in Kimmerer's book, it made me wonder at the ways that students express their own scientific literacies. That is, they developed ways of being, seeing, and engaging in the world through scientific and native perspectives. And I would call their knowledgeable engagement and valuing the interdependence of beings as an expression of science literacy. I look forward to learning from you about your musings and learnings from the reading in our synchronous session. I will close by reading the quote here from Kimmerer. Action on behalf of life transforms because the relationship between the self and the world is reciprocal. It is not a question of first getting enlightened or saved and then acting. As we work to heal the earth heals us. Again, I look forward to learning with you about your wonderings from this readings and how you are being healed by the earth. We now turn to a form of place-based pedagogy that was proposed by David Grunwald in 2003 called Critical Pedagogy of Place. After introducing background on this topic, I'll share my own work in this area. The concept of CPP, or Critical Pedagogy of Place, combines critical pedagogy with place-based education, potentially providing educators with a powerful framework for engaging youth in learning and action that can transform youth's ways of living in places and challenge dominant ways of thinking and practices that have led to unsustainable and exploitative relationships among people and with the planet. Grunwald's original article on CPP has been cited over 2,500 times as of spring 2021. In it, Grunwald maintains CPP's applicability to school curricula. He suggests that students and teachers actually experience and interrogate the places outside of school as part of the school curriculum that are the local context of shared cultural politics. In his description of CPP, he suggests that this pedagogy could blend together the fields of critical pedagogy and place-based education by utilizing the strengths of each field in support of the other. Place-based education has often emphasized rural and ecological learning while problematically ignoring the social, cultural, and political concerns that contribute to systemic social and environmental inequalities. At the same time, critical pedagogy typically overlooks the ecological. To resolve this disjuncture, CPP explicitly examines the place-specific nexus between environment, culture, and education. The first component of CPP, critical pedagogy, asserts that education is political and that education should have social and political transformation as a goal. Critical pedagogy challenges dominant ideologies, discourses, and common sense assumptions. A key feature of critical pedagogy is the development of critical consciousness, in which students learn to identify injustices and oppression and take actions that transform injustices. Such experiences are typically student-centered. They avoid the problematic banking forms of educational knowledge dumping, and students have a role in naming and reclaiming the injustices they identify in their lives. Place-based education, the second field that CPP draws upon, embraces the experience of being human in connection with the others and with the world of nature. Place-based education has grown out of the belief that education should play a role in teaching young people that it is their joint responsibility to conserve and restore shared environments for future generations. Youth, it is argued, need to develop relationships with the environment before they will act on its behalf. In his article, Grunwald describes reinhabitation and decolonization as the intended outcomes of CPP. CPP encourages teachers and students to re-inhabit their places. In other words, to pursue the kind of social action that improves the social and ecological life of places. Grunwald's description of decolonization combines critical consciousness with disrupting settler colonialism. Yet, Indigenous scholars' conceptions of decolonization focus more attention on the need for repatriation of Indigenous lands and people, and the cultural hegemony that permeates settlers' perceptions of re-inhabiting places. Thus, in my own work, in my examination of CPP in classroom curricula, I've examined how critical consciousness from critical pedagogy and decolonization can sometimes be potentially competing, but not incompatible goals. They just have some differing outcomes and characteristics. I'm going to ask you to pause to read a paper that I wrote on this subject called Exploring the Potential and Complexity of a critical pedagogy of place in urban science education. Reading this brings us closer to my second goal for this session, that of adding empirical meat to the theoretical bones in research. Although this widely cited theory, CPP, I note in my research, identified that notably scarce within citations of CPP were examples of its applications, demonstrations of its impact, or validations of its core implications, particularly within formal school science. Also scarce was empirical research that utilizes CPP as an organizing conceptual or pedagogic framework within either formal or informal science education. Thus, this lack of empirical research on CPP with informal science education should not be surprising, as putting action-oriented goals of science education, let alone of CPP, into practice in schools can be wrought with competing constraints, including the structures and aims of public schooling, such as standardized testing and controlling students. In the work I present here, I explore CPP by examining the curricular experiences facilitated by an environmental science teacher, and through analyzing the experiences of youth engaged in this learning. The teacher in this study, who I call Mr. Lincoln, did not explicitly align his pedagogy with CPP. He was not familiar with the construct. As a researcher, however, I identified multiple ways that his practice reflected conceptions of CPP. Highlighting and analyzing features of CPP through this example provides an opportunity to view features of CPP in a formal school setting, to learn how youth make sense of their experiences, and ultimately to explore the potential of CPP in formal school settings. In doing so, I engaged in further theorizing in the field of CPP through its basis and empirically based work. I argue that examining CPP's implications in light of the study's findings starkly reveals the tensions, omissions, and complications of CPP. In the images you see here, youth in the study were engaged in park restoration of 2 parks. This included learning about scientific aspects that were significant within these places. Youth cleaned the parks, engaged in habitat restoration, studying species diversity and removing invasive species, and collected water samples. I'd like you to pause now and engage with this reading, writing down your ideas about CPP and its potential for curricular design and research. I'll admit that I've grown in my own understanding of Indigenous wisdom and decolonization since the time of this writing, and I would shift some of the things in the discussion were I to write it today. Thus, I also invite you to interrogate the text as you consider different aspects of CPP as it relates to your own practices, research, or engagement within the world. As I read this article again, I was once again struck by what the students revealed about the interconnections between social and ecological systems. They took up ideas of re-inhabitation or learning to live well within place. They thoughtfully envisioned futures for themselves and others in the community and constructed ideas of ecological restoration within the context they were familiar with. They attended to the situated context of places with regards to economic and racialized assumptions of advantage and disadvantage. And they considered the impacts of humans on the environment and what this meant for the species that are native to this location. Many of the teachings and much of the sense-making within this study could be viewed through the lenses of engaging in thoughtful, community-centric Western science. The students formed bonds with places, with their teacher, and with each other that were meaningful. And in the words of one of our participants, Michelle, these experiences helped to get the students off their phones and to engage with each other face to face, which she stated was too seldom, but extremely meaningful. I'm heartened by the ways in which the youth in the study became knowledgeable about the different species around them and considered how species interact in their environment. This finding alone should give us reason as educators to engage children and youth in inquiring about and exploring the places around us, to reveal the many layers of context and stories that surround us. That is, to reveal the stories that science may reveal, that other people may reveal, that history reveals, and to envision sustainable ways of living. I'm also heartened at the students' critical awareness they shared in the context of this research. Many of the youth in this study experienced injustices themselves through race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, sexuality, attending low academic schools, and many other life experiences and their interconnecting oppressions. Yet, in our work with the youth, they revealed critiques not necessarily related to themselves, but of their community and of the ways that humans impact the natural environment and more than human inhabitants. These findings suggest that engaging in science in the places that matter to youth help young people see themselves as a part of the natural environment and as carers of the land and places of their communities. In light of my learning from Robin Wall Kimmerer and others, I would view my analysis a little differently and now see how some students held views that are more human centric, while others positioned the importance of the interrelationships in ways that align strongly with Indigenous values. In the discussion section, I argued for a both and approach to considering Indigenous wisdom and decolonization and critical consciousness as a form of critical views of relationships of power. It is significant that youth view themselves and other species within urban places, urban ecological places. Too often, urban areas are viewed as blighted and neglected, and youth, as well as adults, might not investigate the ways that plants emerge from sidewalk cracks as important issues to learn and know. I also wonder if the human centric and Western science forms of cohabitating within places that youth expressed could be seen as a step on the spectrum towards Indigenous wisdom. If they learned the history of places and the forms of interacting with the land from Indigenous community members, would they incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing, such as learning from our oldest teachers, the plants, or seeing themselves or would they see themselves in reciprocal relationships with the land? Would they incorporate these things into their epistemologies? I am curious from other members of this institute if you have experience with incorporating multiple epistemologies into youth's understandings or into your own understandings or actions with the world, or if you have taught from multiple epistemological stances. What can we learn from your experiences? I recognize that many educators feel pressed for time to teach particular topics and to teach according to specific timelines and sequences. And I continue to explore various experiences and resources that we can bring to bear on this topic to further our complications of putting CPP into formal school practice. I also think there is much to learn from informal practices that may shed light on how we best support learners in place-based science. Finally, I continue to reflect on the ways that urban places get positioned and that ecological restoration serves to take up the discourse on sustainable ecosystems. In the discussion, I wrote about this, stating, as youth re-inhabit place, they may reinscribe dominant understandings of dwelling in place that are built upon their erasure and non-existence of prior Indigenous communities through colonization. One way this can be viewed in this case study is through the construction of the parks as neglected places, an ecological and scientific story involving pollutants, trash, and species struggle, a narrative of the city's abandonment of Two Rivers Park, and the mistreatment of both parks by residents for dumping garbage or using parks for illicit purposes. As Paperson contends, a neglected place requires saving and justifies reinvasion, thereby reproducing colonial place claiming. End quote. Youth in urban places often experience multiple forms of oppression and thus should not be tasked with righting the wrongs inflicted upon ecosystems or inflicted upon multiple generations of humans. What then is a productive way forward? My hope is that in building communities and networks through relationships with all inhabitants, we can foster communities of hope and renewal that experience reciprocity through interactions with one another and with the natural world. Since engaging in the work I shared regarding critical pedagogy of place, I have wanted to examine the relationships between science and place learning more deeply. I have sought out ways to better understand how it is that youth engage as knowers and actors within science and knowers and actors within places. I have sought to understand the extent to which learning science within specific places, and in particular, learning science within places that matter to youth, are significant to understanding and constructing these understandings. Thus, I have examined sense making, but my next objective is to examine action. I now turn to our final reading and reflection for this session, my current work, which I'll share on the screen. It's been done in collaboration with my colleagues Ryan Vish and Kendra Ormerod. This work is something that we title Scientific Placemaking. We base this work in the idea that global environmental concerns are, of course, one of our most pressing issues, and further, that preparing youth to take on these scientific challenges, such as the climate crisis, means that youth must be positioned as agents who can enact science to navigate and solve complex scientific problems. At the same time, not all youth are poised to and equally prepared with science resources and participation. And thus, we propose the novel construct in this paper of scientific placemaking, which provides for us a theoretical and analytical lens to explore how place-based science learning can support underrepresented youth in developing science understandings. We draw from a concept called placemaking that's part of urban development work. Within urban development, they refer to placemaking as an action word, and it's a sense making or a process in which people engage in affirming, interrogating, and constructing knowledge about places. And thus, as you can imagine, placemaking is never a neutral process, because not everyone has the same abilities to engage in affirming, interrogating, or constructing knowledge about places. Not everyone is treated as an equal stakeholder, and certainly youth are not. So I'm going to introduce this concept in this paper to you by sharing with you a vignette that we share in the paper. And it's a vignette of a place that we refer to as Boardman Park. Before I begin this vignette, I'll also share that this was a part of a research project in which our research team works with a local environmental organization that works with restoring, protecting, advocating for, and educating the public about environmental issues, and specifically around protecting the water. Because we live on one of the Great Lakes, which is one of the largest freshwater resources in the world. So this organization works with youth in a program that we refer to here as CEYL. And the CEYL program is an after-school program for youth that provides them with environmental science credit at a local community college. And the program lasts, I believe it's 7 weeks, and teaches them environmental science in a place-based way. Okay, so the vignette. On the day of our field trip to Boardman Park, a large and diverse group of community members fish along the river shoreline to the north of the park. Some casually fish with a single rod, while others use multiple rods and an elaborate set of buckets for storing their catch. The CEYL youth students have gathered in the park to learn about toxins in the food chain and to engage in some advocacy work around informing the public about the fish in the river and safe food preparation. Many people in the community, including racially diverse residents and recent immigrants and refugees, utilize the river as a source of food, but may be unaware of the toxins carried by different varieties of fish in the river and the chemicals that can build up in the bodies of people who consume these fish. The facilitators of CEYL provide literature in multiple languages for the youth to pass out to the people fishing. Many of the CEYL students are transnational youth who also have resettled in the location we call Steeltown, and they and other students have familial experiences with fishing and preparing fish to eat. The CEYL youth engage the people fishing in conversation about what they are catching. Some listen and take the literature. Others argue with the youth and seem bothered by their intrusion. Following this experience, Hansa, a transnational student from Thailand, described, "Here, like everything has to be tested by the government and like approved, but in Thailand, like no one cares because all they care about is surviving. But like after learning about the fish, like I really like viewed like water in a different way too. I know a lot of people in like the community, like my ethnicity, we like fishing, and they often fish, and they don't know that the fish that they're eating is bad for them, and they don't care. So that's why I want to like open their eyes and see that it does have an effect." In this vignette, there are many people who are engaged in the act of placemaking. People who are fishing are placemaking as fishers in the area. Um, what you can't see, or what's not represented in this text, are that there are animals also in this location. We've got the fish, we have many creatures, and there are birds who are fishing in this area as well. The CEYL facilitators are engaged as placemakers, and there are also bikers at this location, people riding their bike or recreating in this area, walking and different things. So the humans in this location can be seen as placemakers of different sorts. The youth in this instance are engaged in what we call scientific placemaking. That is, that they're engaged in thinking about, communicating about, and understanding this place through the lens of science. On the left side, we define scientific placemaking as the sense-making processes and practices that youth engage in as they affirm, interrogate, and construct knowledge about science, place, and the interactions between science and place. Within the paper, we go into a deeper theorizing of what scientific placemaking means, and we analyze our data to investigate this. I now invite you to pause the video and read our paper. Please note that the paper is currently under review at a journal, so we ask that you do not share it with anyone. And as you read the paper, please consider how understandings of both science and place get constructed and positioned by youth, and what this can mean for designing curricular experiences for learners. In this closing segment, I want to examine the paper more closely with you and talk about what I think it contributes to our understanding of science, teaching and learning, and to place-based science. Now, in the prior work, our focus was on complicating theory through empirical work. And in this paper, the focus is on building, developing, and extending theory with empirical work. Within these findings, there's a number of things that stand out to me in the findings. One is we were able to engage in a close examination of scientific sense-making, and this gives us insight into youth learning. One of the things that I think is really fascinating is the way that meaning making of both science and place are mutually constitutive. So that is, they developed differently and developed significance and relevance for the youth as a result of learning both together, or learning science within particular places. I also find it fascinating and really important that both science and place were viewed by youth as dynamic. That is, they were socially, culturally, and politically situated. They were subject to a past and to a present and to a future. Now, in prior research, for the most part, I've seen that researchers themselves have talked about place as being dynamic and place as being socially, culturally, politically situated. But I rarely see that within research coming from the participants themselves. So I think this is particularly significant. The youth also engaged as meaning makers of the places that they inhabit and through these scientific lenses. Thus, they are agents of their own sense-making practices, and they can leverage science for their own purposes. There's a line I wanted to read from a piece of our discussion. It says, our research resonates with prior research and adds that place-based science situated in the communities of learners and resonating with the concerns of the learners' communities can similarly support youth to negotiate science along with multiple epistemologies. So I think this is also very significant that as we're looking for ways for youth to integrate um, science epistemologies, we're thinking about it from the standpoint of not replacing prior epistemologies with a Western science one, but rather making room for multiple. Another piece that stands out to me is that the locally meaningful science learning that occurred in this study provides opportunities for youth to focus on their own communities and to ask questions that we referred to in the discussion as questions that outsiders might not consider. So in this sense, youth's sense of belonging within and positioning of specific places through the lens of science can yield solutions, scientific solutions, and place-specific challenges, which is really significant in particular within ecologically and socioeconomically vulnerable communities. So in closing, I want to ask you two things to bring to the table. One is to consider the possibilities for science learning and for curricular experiences that may be afforded by drawing upon Indigenous ways of knowing, critical pedagogy of place, and scientific placemaking. The second is to bring your own wonderings and reflections to our synchronous time. So I'll ask you to share about a place that matters to you at the start of our session together. Thank you for engaging in this journey into critical pedagogies of place with me, and I look forward to our continued wonderings and sense making.